Thank you so much for tuning into my show, William Wallace for America. And thank you so much to my sponsors for making it possible. Please check out Bond Arms by going to bondarms.com. Send them an email and tell them William Wallace sent you. But also, you can get discounts at My Pillow and Patriot Mobile using the links and the codes down at the bottom that are scrolling my screen. If you're listening to the podcast, you're going to go to patriotmobile.com/WWFA to get discounts on getting started and better rates and better coverage. And also at My Pillow, mypillow.com/WWFA to get up to 80% off. Let's get started with the podcast and talking about what does Budapest have to do with the Ukraine. A few weeks ago, I started this deep dive and I kept hearing some different things in the news that almost sounded a little bit how shall I say, contradictory of each other. Or and there were some things that were just kind of sticking out in my head. Like they keep talking about is Zelensky the bad guy? Is Russia Putin the bad guy? Who's the good guy? And I just started kind of digging a little bit. And when I did, I found this thing called the Budapest Memorandum, the Budapest Agreement signed in 1994, and I started researching it. And as I researched it and started finding some other articles, I started reading some things that I felt you, my listeners, would want to know because there's a lot of contradictory things. And so I thought, what a better way to cover this than with my podcast because it's not something that we're hearing about in the news a whole lot, the Budapest Agreement, that is. A couple people have mentioned it, and there's some articles out there about it, which I'm going to go in. I'm going to do a deep dive on two articles, one short, one long, but I'm going to include some of my research here as a way to make you think out of the box a little bit because when you hear about it, it might help you, as it did me, connect some dots on what we're hearing in the news. Not any dots connected are going to answer questions or solve the issue. That is, it's going to make you actually ask some more questions, which I'm doing, and that's why I'm bringing it to you. The Budapest Agreement, which was signed like in 1984, I'm going to go over that in a minute. But here's some things that I want you to think about, and I'm going to comment on in these articles that I'm bringing to you and reading from during the time I read these articles. I'm going to comment on some of this stuff. And so I'm gonna highlight it now so you'll kind of be prepared. You're going to want to know what's in it because some of these things are being said publicly. And as I read the memorandum and you hear about these things that are being said, like when Trump said that Putin is not the aggressor, that it's Zelensky, and you hear these things and you go, wait a minute, we've seen this in the news. We're going to cover that also. That's a stand out a little bit. I'm covering it to make you think, not to tell you who is right or who is wrong. Is it Trump is the good guy, bad guy, and what he thinks he said? Is it Zelensky? There's just going to be some interesting things that are going to come out. And I'm not being duplicitous at all whatsoever. I'm just trying to expose that there's a lot more to what's going on in the Ukraine than what I thought. Of course, they make it real simple in the news. Russia invaded Ukraine. We got to spend money helping them. And then we're hearing the flip side, as I heard one time, that Russia's the good guy because there's Nazis in the Ukraine, which to me sounded like conspiracy thinking until I got into the Budapest Memorandum and some other articles where I found out. Also, there was a movie by Roger Stone called Ukraine on Fire. I did a little bit deeper dive. I watched the movie. It's actually really interesting with some unique information. For instance, when I watched the movie, it was eye-opening. It did a history of Ukraine going way back before the 1900s, and you'll see that in their blood, in their DNA, so to speak, they are known to be switching sides. Ukraine has been known to not only switch sides, but make agreements and then violate those agreements. not saying they're, how shall we say this, Benedict Arnolds maybe, or traitors to their own people, or whatever the case may be. But it is eye-opening when you see what's going on in their history, which Roger Stone brought that out. He also brought out that Crimea was not a takeover by, or it's not really thought of by some people as being a takeover of Russia, because there were actually elections. You see, it's hard to kind of explain some of this as I've read it, because what we're hearing in the news is entirely different from when you actually study the history of it, which is why I thought it was so important to bring it to you. But the Roger Stone movie talks about how the Ukraine has always been kind of a curious place, how they've always kind of switched sides with their agreements. And when you start to think about Crimea, we're told in the news that it was taken over by Russia. But what's not publicly mentioned a whole lot, which is talked about in this movie, is that there was an election in Crimea where the people actually voted for it. In just a minute, I'll read a short article about something that Obama said at the 20-year mark during 20 years after the Budapest Agreement. Either way, they talk about how Crimea was not taken over by Russia. There was actually an election. The Nazis, it sounds like a conspiracy. My question, at what point did Ukraine go rogue? Or has Ukraine just been a playground for the rich? And for many, many years, is it just a battleground, if you will, no pun intended, for what's happening today? Is it a place where there's always been underhanded things going on, and we're not being told the true story because they don't want us to know, because that's where they're hiding everything? Sounds a little conspiratorial, but when you start to look at all the different things that I'm bringing out to you in this, as I'm setting the table, and when I start to read some of these agreements and some of these things to you, I think it's going to be eye opening. So is Putin really the good guy, or is he the bad guy? Or is he the bad guy and some think he's the good guy? Either way, we're going to find that the Ukraine and what's going on right now is more than just a curious place. But a little bit background, real quick, about also about Vladimir Zelensky. He was born in 1978, and he is of course, this is a little bio on him. He's a Ukrainian politician, former entertainer, who has served, we all know he's a comedian, as the 6th and current president of Ukraine since 2019. So he was not president very long before the war started. And either way, which of course started in 2022, Ukraine became a country in 1991. The act established Ukraine's state independence from the Soviet Union. The declaration was affirmed by a majority of Ukrainians in all regions of Ukraine by an independence referendum on the 1st of December 1991, followed by international recognition starting on the following day. Ukrainian independence led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union by 26th of December 1991. Zelensky is born to a Ukrainian Jewish family. So if there are Nazis in the Ukraine, as the Roger Stone movie went into, and some other things that I've read also goes into, then why would Zelensky be protecting them within his own country if he's Jewish and there's really Nazis, which kind of squashes the conspiracy thinking. But the whole Nazi thing has come up in several articles that I've read, one of which I'm going to go over with you here in just a few minutes. Then I'll try to keep it short, but there's some really interesting things in it that I think you'll like. Also, I'm going to go over the connection to the Bidens. And I'm not giving the Bidens a pass at all whatsoever, because, we keep hearing how Biden, if you don't fire the prosecutor, you're not going to get the billion. And then his son was involved. So were the Bidens covering up something just for them? There's also an article, I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to tell you the summarization of it, which was that while Biden, you know, used his influence, or Hunter used the influence of his dad, Biden used his influence as vice president in that incident. Like I said, get the billion, don't get the billion kind of thing. But what this article did was it said, hey, it's not giving Biden a pass, but Biden, the Hunter thing was a small thing that was going on. When Biden made that comment, he was trying to cover up or squash a bigger thing that was going on, and his son was just a small part of it. So while we look at that comment as being protecting his son, this article went into how Biden was actually trying to cover up a much bigger scheme. Again, not giving Biden a pass for it and not trying to give an other side, but I guess I am giving the other side. What I'm really trying to do is just, again, throw out all this stuff that there's more going on in Ukraine than what the news media and our elected officials are telling us, that I found in some of these articles. Some people claim that Russia, like I said, that Russia is the good guy because they're getting rid of whatever in the Ukraine. I'm just curious if this war, whether it's from Putin being the bad guy or the good guy, United States offering some bombs, if they're not just trying to destroy all the evidence of what was happening in the Ukraine. And maybe that's why we're not being told all of the details. But isn't it the but is it a fact, or have we disregarded the agreement after Ukraine was vulnerable as a sign of a bad actor? So when you see this, again, some of these articles I'm about to go over here with you, I think it's going to be eye-opening. Let's first go over what the summarization of what the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 actually was. So again, Ukraine becomes a country in 1991. You've got a couple years where the Ukraine was actually the third largest nuclear state in the world, in competition against the US and Russia. They're not going to like that, especially Russia, because Ukraine's right there. So the following is a text of the Memorandum on Security Assurances, known as the Budapest Memorandum, in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed December 5th, 1994. The United States of America, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland welcoming the accession of Ukraine to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapons state, taking into account the commitment of Ukraine to eliminate all nuclear weapons from its territory within a specified period of time. Noting the changes in the worldwide security situation, including the end of the Cold War, which have brought about conditions for deep reductions in nuclear forces. Again, here's the two major superpowers kind of bringing in some other people saying, we got to get rid of this other guy because they're competing with us, meaning Ukraine. Let's get them out of the nuclear race and kind of back there a little bit. That's just me saying that. Confirming the following: the United States, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE, Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, final act to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine. Some important things are coming up, by the way. The United States of America, Russian Federation, blah, 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 reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. Russia was in there, United States of America, the Russian Federation, to refrain from the threat or use of force against the Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense. Again, key phrase here in this memorandum pertaining to what we're hearing but now, when Trump said that Putin's not the bad guy. Putin's in self-defense. Again, something to note here. Or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, which we all know that part of this memorandum, or you didn't know as part of this memorandum, that the Ukraine was not going to be allowed to be in the United Nations, which is kind of an organization, a club, if you will, where they'll protect each other with force if need be. But as I go on, you're going to see how the Ukraine is not given that membership. We know that now, but we're going to kind of see some things why in the Budapest Memorandum. The United States of America, Russian Federation, United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland reaffirmed their commitment to Ukraine with this is it kind of repeats itself a couple times. So when I don't repeat it, you kind of know. Final act to refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate to their own interest the exercise by Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty, and thus to secure advantages of any kind, economic coercion, mineral rights, anybody. Again, not being duplicitous, not being anti-Trump, but now we're hearing some of these things come out about mineral rights, and then it kind of goes away and you kind of hear an argument in the background, but nobody's mentioning this agreement. The United States of America, Russian Federation, United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate United Nations Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Notice, they're providing assistance, not a guarantee of assistance, and not a guarantee to come to their aid in the event of war, which is why you see a lot of these European countries have kind of stayed out of this thing. Well, this is why. They're not either because Ukraine's not a member of the United Nations, but also because they're saying that Ukraine is an act. If someone should have if they're a victim of an act of aggression, and there's that question still lingering: were they a victim, or are they the actual aggressor? So you see this kind of confusion going on, which you haven't really thought of as confusion. You just kind of took it from the news. Yeah, those other countries aren't being involved. They're not a member of NATO. Maybe that's why. But the argument keeps coming up. Who was the aggressor in these passive comments that you're hearing without any reference to the Budapest Memorandum? The United States of America, Russian Federation, United Kingdom, all the way to Northern Ireland, reaffirm in the case of the Ukraine their commitment not to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, except in the case of an attack on themselves, their territories, or independent territories, their armed forces, or their allies by such a state in association or alliance with a nuclear weapon state. This paragraph, I want to refer back to Putin's agreement earlier, or Putin's statement earlier, when he kept saying about how he might use nuclear weapons. Was that a test to see who would come to the aid of Ukraine, or was that throwing it out there? And then somebody behind the scenes said, "Hey, Vladimir, remember you signed the Budapest Agreement, and you can't do that. That's specific." So nuclear weapons are specific, but assistance in this agreement in some languages, which I'll bring out here in a minute, assistance refers to a guarantee of coming to their aid. In some cases, it doesn't. But in all cases, they refer to the English translation, which assistance means kind of coming to their aid, using force, or in this case, it refers to assistance in the Budapest Agreement. But they purposely, as I'll explain in one of these articles, I know there's some of these articles I'm reading first, should have read the other ones first, but the other ones didn't explain some of this stuff that I'm going into, so I'll refer back to it here in just a minute. The United States of America, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland will consult in the event a situation arises which raises a question concerning these commitments. This memorandum will become applicable upon signature, signed, and 4 copies having equal validity in the English, Russian, and Ukrainian languages, which is really specific when it comes to which was used, the English version of assistance or the Russian version of it. So this is not the article that I want to read yet. I'll explain this. I'll go on this one first. A lot of people want to refer to, well, Crimea was taken over. Remember, Crimea was its own independent state, but it was in Ukraine territory. It was kind of that gray area because remember, it all used to be under the Soviet Union at one time. And when the Soviet Union broke up, some of these borders became kind of gray lines. I guess you'll say, it kind of became, whose border it really was. And then, of course, there's the question about, was Crimea taken over or was it an actual election, as was explained in the Roger Stone video? But he also explained the other side from the naysayers' point of view, that Russia used force to get the 90+% by at the election, at the ballot box, we'll say, to get the people to actually vote for it. There was actually a show of force there at the ballot box. Obama explains why the U.S. didn't intervene when Crimea was annexed. Now, again, he doesn't mention elections. I want to make that a point of something to note here. Obama didn't refer to the elections. He just said that his reason for saying he didn't intervene, even though there's the Budapest Agreement and Crimea was that gray area, he said there were many Russian sympathizers. Former U.S. President Barack Obama, whose second term fell on Russia's annexation of Crimea and its invasion of Donbass, explained the lack of active support for Kiev from the West compared to the events of 2022. Obama said in his interview with CNN, according to Obama, Ukraine in 2014 was not the Ukraine we are talking about today. There's a reason why there was not an armed invasion of Crimea, because Crimea was full of Russian speakers, and there was some sympathy to the view that Russia was representing its interest. The Rada, Ukrainian parliament at the time, still had a number of Russian sympathizers. The politics inside Ukraine were complicated, he added. The U.S. president also stood up for former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who has been criticized for rapprochement with Russia and not being tough enough. So it goes on to talk about how there was no military invasion of Crimea, was repeatedly refuted by Putin himself. That article, I want to give credit, was by Ureinska Pravda and Urinka, I might be saying it wrong, Ureinska Pravda. That was an article by him. So I think it's important to note that even when that article was written about Obama, there's all these gray areas, all this hidden language in that seems like, as a point at the Budapest Agreement, that is in reference to the Budapest Agreement, but there's no mention of it. And I just am curious why, which again is why I'm bringing this out, to show all the disparities and kind of compare them in one episode on my show. This article was written in 2014 by Stephen Pfeiffer, spelled Piffer, from the Brookings Institute. And I found it interesting because it contradicts, it's at the 20-year anniversary, and it contradicts the next article that I'm going to go over on the 30-year anniversary. But remember, this is in 2014, before Vladimir Zelensky was in office and before the before the invasion of Ukraine, depending on who the bad guy is, I guess. December 5th marks the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances for Ukraine. Russia has grossly violated the commitments it made in that document. This, by the way, is in reference to Crimea, that imposes an obligation on Washington to support Ukraine and push back against Russia. This is not just a matter of living up to the U.S. obligations. It is also about preserving the credibility of security assurances, not a guarantee of assistance, which could contribute to preventing nuclear proliferation in the future. As many analysts note, Vladimir Putin may have more at stake in Ukraine than does the West. The United States, however, has a strong interest that stems not just from 23 years of bilateral relations with Kiev, but from U.S. commitments in the Budapest Memorandum. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, nuclear arms lay in sites scattered across the former Soviet republics. Ukraine inherited the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, including some 1,900 strategic nuclear weapons designed to strike the United States. Yet another important note, probably why the United States pushed that Budapest Agreement so much. Nothing in the post-Soviet space commanded more attention from the Bush 41 and Clinton administrations than making sure that the Soviet Union's demise did not increase the number of nuclear-armed states. Washington brokered with Kiev and Moscow the terms under which the Ukraine agreed to eliminate the strategic missile silos and bombers on its territory and transfer the 1,900 nuclear weapons to Russia for disassembly. Again, this article was in 2014 on the 20th anniversary of the Budapest Agreement. So there, you're going to notice some things that sound the same to what's going on today, but very different. I wanted to note that again. A key element of the arrangement, many Ukrainians would say the key element was the readiness of the United States and Russia, joined by Britain, to provide security assurances. The Budapest Memorandum committed Washington, Moscow, and London, among other things, to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine and to refrain from the threat or use of force against that country. I want to point out at this point in this article that we're kind of hearing whispers that if under a ceasefire agreement, Russia may get to keep parts of Ukraine. Also, United States wants those mineral rights and half the income or whatever it is. The Kremlin has violated those commitments using soldiers in Russian combat fatigues without identifying insignia from whom Mr. Putin later admitted were Russian. Moscow seized when Moscow seized Crimea in March. Again, they're saying that now it was done more subversively. Russia subsequently encouraged and armed separatists in eastern Ukraine. Again, we're told that there was an election in one part, but now they're showing this in this article how there was probably coercion. Again, Russia subsequently encouraged and armed separatists in eastern Ukraine when the Ukrainian military appeared to gain the upper hand against the separatists. Regular Russian army units entered the Donetsk and Luhansk to support them. So you see, it's almost like Russian put in these forces that didn't have Russian outfits on. So when Ukraine defended themselves, then it made Ukraine look like the bad guys under the Budapest Agreement, and Russia got to say, "Oh no, we're defending ourselves now." Of course, there's always an election. What part of its commitments to the respect the independence and refrain from the threat or use of force do the Russians not understand? This article goes on to say, since the Ukraine-Russia crisis erupted, Washington has provided political and economic support to Kiev, as well as non-lethal military assistance. It has worked with the Russian Union to put in place increasingly tough sanctions on the Russian economy. You see, there's that little fine gray line that talks about assistance and support instead of coming to their aid with force. Washington should do no more. It is time to provide the Ukrainian military defensive arms, such as light anti tank weapons. Again, this is before the Ukrainian war that we're experiencing now. This is just during Crimea. That would raise the cost to the Russian army of any further fighting to help deter it. Washington should also be prepared if Moscow does not alter the course and facilitate a peaceful settlement to work with Europe to impose additional economic sanctions. You see, this is before Trump's first presidency that they're talking about arming Ukraine in a way that Russia wouldn't go into Ukraine. They're already in Crimea, and so they already know, the world already knows Russia's intentions. So again, Trump's right in this. Again, not again, but again, as a way to segue it, Trump was right that the Ukrainian war could have been prevented, as it could have been had they started arming Ukraine back then. But would that have violated the Budapest Agreement that went into effect if Ukraine was attacked? But there's that shady gray area again of the Crimea story that nobody is being very specific about. They're kind of being more vague about. These are actions that the United States owes Ukraine for giving up the nuclear arms on its territory. In 1994, Washington wrote Kiev a check for U.S. support in the Budapest Memorandum, albeit hoping that it would never be cashed. Unfortunately, it has. That, again, this article is in 2014, and it's happening once again, which is why you see us supporting it. And of course, there's Republicans who say, oh, we can't give them support. But the Budapest Agreement, which forces the United States to do it, is not even being mentioned publicly. And again, I'm curious as to why it's not, why they're not doubling it, not why they're not saying, hey, we're contractually obligated. Instead, we have all these little innuendos and things that are coming out in the news that I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I noticed and wanted to bring these articles and pieces of information to you, not as a way to sound conspiratorial or try to prove a conspiracy, as a way to say there's a lot more going on. And of course, everybody's like, yeah, Captain Obvious. I get that. There's always something more going on. But as a way to, so when the future news stories come out, some of this stuff is going to pop out at you, which I'm hoping that the truth comes out. But I got some more information for you, and we're going to continue with the end of this article. Security assurances such as those in the Budapest Memorandum do not carry as much weight as NATO security guarantee. Security assurances such as those in the Budapest Memorandum do not carry as much weight as NATO security guarantees, or the guarantees and the mutual security treatments that the United States has with Japan and South Korea. Still, security assurances have played a role in the effort to freeze and end North Korea's nuclear program. This is what I was referring to earlier that I was kind of waiting to get to, that the Budapest Memorandum talks about assurances. It doesn't talk about guarantees. And I've said this once, but I'm going to say it a little bit more clear now, that in some languages, assurances can be interpreted or mean guarantees. And in other languages, assurances just mean like, whatever. They don't mean guarantees. And they're talking about how the Budapest Memorandum is written in multiple languages. Some of those languages use assurances where they want it to mean guarantee, and some of those times in other languages, They use assurances as it means, whatever. So we got to wonder if there was an actual intention to do that in the to use that word as in different languages. So some countries could be like, yeah, we don't have to guarantee it. Assurance doesn't mean that in our language, and in some it does. Go down that rabbit hole if you will, but on a above, on the gist level, looking over from above view, you'll see that there's a lot of ambiguity with it. And curiously, is that intentional or not? I think it is, because as I read some of these other articles that we don't have time to read today, they talk about that. They say, hey, there's assurances and there's guarantees, which is why the United States isn't guaranteeing, and they're still talking about not bringing Ukraine, even when they settle this war, not letting Ukraine be in NATO, which is a guarantee, opposed to the Budapest Memorandum, which is assurances. I'll continue. Um, these kinds of assurances may not by themselves offer major leverage. However, when looking for ways to prevent nuclear proliferation, Washington and its partners should marshal every possible tool. The problem is that Russia's actions against Ukraine have discredited security assurances. If a North Korean diplomat were to ask his or her Ukrainian counterpart how the Budapest Memorandum worked out, the response would not be a happy one. At a September conference in Kiev, former President Leonid Kukma, who signed the Budapest Memorandum for Ukraine, said that Ukraine had been cheated. Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk referred to the notorious Budapest Memorandum. Such comments do not make good advertisements for security or for future. This is the key thing. For future security assurances, such comments do not make good advertisements for future security assurances. Again, this is in 2014, way before they needed either assurances or guarantees. And notice they brought up North Korea in this article, and North Korea, not part of the Budapest Agreement, was able to send troops to help Russia against Ukraine. So we see that played out on the world stage. In conclusion of this article, Washington cannot undo Russia's violations. It can and should, however, do more to fulfill its obligations under the Budapest Memorandum by doing more to bolster Ukraine and penalize Russia until Moscow alters its policy. Such U.S. such U.S. action could also change the Ukrainian narrative in the hypothetical conversation with a North Korean diplomat to the Russians violated the memorandum. Reading that slowly for a reason, but the Americans backed us to the fullest and made Moscow pay. That would help restore the credibility to security assurances as an element in the toolkit of America's non-proliferation diplomacy. That's from the Budapest Memorandum article from the Brookings Institute in 2014 by Stephen Pifer, Pifer. So now you're beginning to see some of the ambiguities and some of the things that made me question things that are being said today after having read the Budapest Memorandum. And I'll go on with this last article that I think is extremely informative and really brings us up to today's times in reference to the Budapest Memorandum. This was written in the Articles of War magazine from the Lieber Institute at West Point, named Ukraine Symposium, the Budapest Memorandum's History and Role in the Conflict, by Robert Lawless of the Lieber Institute. Last month of 2024 marked the 30th anniversary, now we're 10 years later, of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, part of an agreement by which Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in return for security assurances by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The memorandum, signed on December 5th, 1994, was a major event in international relations. Its significance is relevant not only in the context of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the post Cold War era, it also serves as a key moment in the nuclear arms control movement, as well as an important example of international dispute resolution, especially in the context of relations between powerful states. On December 3rd of last year, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement marking the anniversary of the memorandum. In the statement, Ukraine described how Russia blatantly disregarded its obligations under the memorandum and international law in general in pursuit of its ongoing aggression against Ukraine. According to Ukraine, at the time it was signed, the memorandum was to become a significant step in strengthening global nuclear disarmament and serve as an example for other states to give up nuclear weapons, while at the same time rewarding Ukraine for responsibly relinquishing its nuclear arsenal with guarantees of security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Well, I want to make a note here. We have Ukraine gave up their weapons to be a good guy, to be a have a be a good active member of the international community in return for the assurances, even though they didn't get the UN guarantees. And now, and since this agreement, they've lost Crimea, which of course some say it was part of Ukraine, some say it wasn't. I get that. Election, not election. Either way, there's all these ambiguities that come up that I believe are intentional, not conspiratorial. When you look at some of these things that point out that, are the world players, were they acting, were they good actors? Were they say, look, this is for the better for all of us, that we get rid of, we have a country get rid of their nuclear weapons, and do we have a good result at the end? Or in this case, Ukraine is basically losing their sovereignty. And even if we have a peace agreement come out of this, is Russia going to get some of their territory back? And then, knowing that Russia has violated the Budapest Agreement twice, of course, depending on whose interpretation you're looking at, assurances, guarantee, bad guy, good guy, or that, back to those Nazi thing, the conspiracy sounding theory that Russia was the good guy because there's Nazis in Ukraine, which was exposed in the Roger Stone movie, and people that are giving Russia a pass because they're actually going after Nazis. Of course, even though Zelensky is, Jewish by birth and blood, and you don't hear about any of these Nazis now, makes you scratch your head. That, is that true or not true, of course, but also who's getting the pass, and who's giving us the factual information, and is that part being covered up in a way that would make Russia look like the good guy if there were actually Nazis there on a world stage, I'm referring to. I'll continue with the articles of war. Instead, according to Ukraine, the agreement failed to fulfill its functions and set a dangerous precedent that undermined confidence in the very idea of nuclear disarmament. Furthermore, this failure has led to a catastrophic increase in security threats around the world, as well as active attempts by various countries from the Indo-Pacific region and the Middle East to the Euro-Atlantic area to create or expand their existing nuclear arsenals. Again, this is referring to, are we getting bad examples? Are we giving a bad example to other countries that, hey, we'll give you assurances if you're playing nice on an international level and give up your nuclear weapons, and then if you get invaded later, we're going to ignore you. And so again, this article is in reference to what's going on today, 30 years after the Budapest Agreement, and we're seeing how it could lead to examples of other countries around the world. Like, for instance, you've got Iran, which is now known to have um, or be building a nuclear arsenal. Again, of course, it depends on what information you read. And then, of course, the Biden administration was the one who has given them the pass, or the Obama administration sent them the cash. They got, Obama brings them, gives them cash. Biden gives them a pass on the world stage. And now, if we're not defending Ukraine under the Budapest Agreement, does that empower countries like Iran and even North Korea, who jumped in with Russia in this war? All of this, I believe, is bubbling up out of the Budapest Agreement. Not a reaction from it, but in reference to it in many ways. On 5 December, a spokeswoman for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded to the Ukrainian statement. She accused Ukraine of engaging in acts of anti-Russia propaganda and a disinformation campaign. See, Russia's not the bad guy. They're actually the good guy here, comprised of legally untenable insinuations about Russia. The spokeswoman asserted that Russia has strictly complied with the provisions of the Budapest Memorandum, which was not an international treaty, but rather a package of political agreements. According to Russia, it was Ukraine that had failed to honor its commitments. They're the bad guy, right? In part by openly encouraging nationalism in its radical forms. This is in reference to the Nazi statement that was in the Roger Stone movie, and through the heroization of Nazi criminals in state policy. It comes out in this article, so it's not just the Roger Stone movie. Again, the Budapest Memorandum, which was not an international treaty, as said by the Russian spokeswoman, but rather a package of political agreements. According to Russia, it was Ukraine that had failed to honor its commitments, in part by openly encouraging nationalism in its radical forms and through the heroization of Nazi criminals in state policy, not just letting them be there, but in their policy. Furthermore, the Russian spokeswoman accused the United States and a number of EU countries of having blatantly disregarded Ukraine's sovereignty. So it's not Russia violating their sovereignty, it's the United States and the EU countries disregarding Ukraine's sovereignty. You see, it's all head scratching. It's all this ambiguity that they throw out to, I think, confuse the regular people so they can get away with the destruction of their playground, where they've had some money laundering going on, possibly, or other nefarious things happening, and unceremoniously interfered in its internal and external affairs by dragging it into bloc confrontation driven schemes against Russia. She warned that such conduct could increase the risk of a direct military clash between nuclear powers. It is worth revisiting the Budapest Memorandum, especially in light of its 30th anniversary. The recent dire accusations by both Ukrainian and Russian officials in connection with the agreement and the larger context of the ongoing armed conflict in Ukraine. In this post, the writer reviews the history of the memorandum, its legal status, and terms. That's the writer is Robert Lawless of the Lieber Institute, and its role in the current context of the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict. The memorandum's history and its role in current affairs serves as an example of the power of international diplomacy, a reminder of the importance of properly identifying the legal status of international agreements and a warning of the consequences of states reneging on their legal and non-legal commitments. And I will add, I guess it's all how they write the treaties and in reference to which language recognizes which words and where the back doors are through this language that they can use to be able to not only play their game of chess or Risk, if you remember the game of Risk, of world domination or regional domination, or in this case, Russia's goal is to reunite the Soviet Union. Either way, I'll continue. Post Soviet Ukraine, an independent state with a nuclear arsenal. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union stored thousands of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then one of the Soviet republics in 1991. Upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent state. It inherited, as we know, the nuclear arsenal. Both Russia and the United States recoiled at the notion of a nuclear armed Ukraine. Additionally, somewhat controversial. I won't go read this part because we've kind of gone over that information in the other article. I'll continue, though, with this one, a few paragraphs down from the new information. Each of the three states had its own reasons for pursuing the transfers. The United States aimed to eliminate or remove nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory as part of a broader effort to ensure that the breakup of the Soviet Union did not increase the number of nuclear weapon states. Similarly, Russia's goal was to consolidate the Soviet nuclear arsenal on Russian territory so that Russia emerged as the sole post-Soviet nuclear weapon state. Again, now we know that they wouldn't put the Soviet Union back together. By agreeing to give up its nuclear arsenal, Ukraine sought political guarantees. I am going to read this paragraph, this information again on this paragraph, because it's very important that they keep bringing up guarantees and assurances. Ukraine sought guarantees that its sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected, and it hasn't. Additionally, Ukraine wished to secure financial assistance. Give me some money. Again, on this international playground where a lot of money laundering is going in. And Roger Stone's movie actually goes into that in their past history. Financial assistance, both as remuneration for valuable nuclear fuel it possessed, as well as to defray the cost of transferring and eliminating nuclear weapons from its territory. These specific considerations were nested within Ukraine's broader aims to firm up its international standing as an independent and sovereign state and to establish favorable relationships with the United States and other major Western powers. Now we're hearing about their mineral rights, of course. Negotiations leading to the Budapest Memorandum, a key question related to nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory was whether, and if so, how, the newly independent Ukraine would join the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We can have nuclear weapons, but you can't. And again, rightfully so, because we'll see through Ukraine's history that they weren't a great actor in many times in history. The Strategic Arms Treaty was a bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia known as START 1. It required each state to reduce the number of strategic nuclear weapons in its nuclear stockpiles. The numeral distinguished it from a second bilateral nuclear disarmament treaty, START 2. Although the latter never entered into force, START 1 expired in 2001 and 2009. START 1 was signed in 1991, but the fall of the Soviet Union delayed its entry into force. Both the United States and Russia wanted to ensure that neither Ukraine's independence nor the nuclear weapons on its territory disrupted the implementation of the treaty. Meanwhile, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is a multilateral treaty designed to halt the spread of nuclear weapons and further the aim of achieving nuclear disarmament. The treaty has 191 states parties. It distinguishes between nuclear weapon states, parties, and non-nuclear weapon states, parties. Under the treaty, the nuclear weapon states parties are China, France, Russia. Notice under the nuclear weapon states parties are China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. All other parties are considered non-nuclear weapon states. So they include China in this nuclear weapon state, and France and the United Kingdom, but we never hear about their nuclear weapons. Just pointing that out. As the name implies, non-nuclear weapon states parties are prohibited under the treaty from receiving or manufacturing nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia both sought for Ukraine to join the non-proliferation treaty as a member or as a non-nuclear weapon, as a non-nuclear weapon state. Find all of that very, 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 very interesting to make note of. It's important to note, and I think it's important to note at this point that Iran actually, and I got it right here, Iran was one of the original 62 signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and which was signed, by the way, in 1970, the most important global treaty on the world's deadliest weapon. It went into effect in 1970 and has been the standard of nuclear arms control ever since. It banned countries other than the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France from acquiring nuclear weapons. In return, the non-nuclear signatories were permitted to develop peaceful nuclear programs for power generation. By 2020, 190 countries had signed it. And of course, we keep hearing, going back and forth, to how Iran, we're just developing peaceful nuclear power for ourselves. We're not violating that agreement at all. And how the Budapest Agreement is kind of tied into the non-proliferation agreement. And of course, how it comes back to Iran violating that, and how the Ukraine is kind of how should I say, ground zero for what's going on with the nuclear arms race and everything else that's been going on as a playground, as I said before, for money laundering. Something else to point out on this is on January 20th, 2020, Iran threatened to withdraw from the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty if European powers refer Iran to the UN Security Council over its breaches of the 2015 nuclear deal. Quote, and of course, this would be in Iranian. If the Europeans continue their improper behavior or send Iran's file to the Security Council, we will withdraw from the NPT, Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, said Foreign Minister Javed Zarif. Britain. I'm sorry. It's a weird name. Javed Zarif. So if you say something bad about me, you tell on me, we're going to withdraw from the treaty. That's kind of what it sounds like to me. Get out of this one here. On back. So it's just interesting how it's connected. I'll continue. Separately, in 1992, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, as well as Belarus and Kazakhstan, as Soviet successor states, negotiated and signed the Lisbon Protocol, which is a treaty which, among other things, obligated Ukraine as one of the successor states to the Soviet Union to assume the Soviet obligations under START 1. So they said, hey, you're grandfathered into this treaty because Russia was part of it. The protocol also committed Ukraine to joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state party in the shortest possible time. So now we're talking about kind of the Budapest Agreement and these other agreements that kind of sit and kind of hover over the top of it as doubling down, if you will, and how the violations and depending on the language used and depending on what treaty pertains has been the loophole for all of these countries to either be involved in Ukraine or not be involved and be able to cast stones on who the real bad guy is. So, after some delay, the Ukrainian parliament ratified START 1 and the Lisbon Protocol. However, the Ukrainian resolution ratifying the protocol included several significant conditions, including Ukraine obtaining security guarantees and financial assistance for transferring the nuclear weapons out of its territory. I'm curious, will Trump get the monetary benefit for the United States, of course, out of this that they keep referring to as a way of assurance or guarantee to Ukraine future security, or how much will they profit from it? Effectively, the Ukrainians' parliament ratification resolution established a Ukrainian view that satisfaction of its request was a prerequisite to bring START 1 into force, as well as to secure Ukraine's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This occurred within the context of significant tension within the Ukrainian government, with many officials and legislators expressing signs of hesitation without or about a commitment to relinquish the nuclear arsenal on Ukrainian territory and the requirements set forth in the Lisbon Protocol. Once again, this article from Articles of War, Lieber Institute, Robert Lawless, he goes on to say, high-level negotiations took place between 1991 and 1994. Eventually, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine established an agreement in principle memorialized in a trilateral statement signed on January 14th, 1994 by the presidents of the United States, Russia, and Ukraine in Moscow. According to the agreement, Ukraine would relinquish the nuclear weapons in return for security assurances and financial assistance. Who got that money? Who knows? By the way, while I'm bringing up financial assistance, I want to point out something about that right now. There's a lot of talk that the United States should not be given any financial assistance because we're broke. We can't afford to keep giving this. But again, as I said earlier, there's no reference to the Budapest Agreement that kind of requires us to give them assistance and not guarantees. But a lot of people are saying, Ukraine's getting all this money, and of course, Zelensky's skimming off the top. I don't know how much Zelensky can skim, might be some, but what we found in one of the other interviews that I've done is that Ukraine is not getting all the money that the United States is printing to give them the assistance. The United States is buying supplies, weapons, ammunition, assistance, physical assistance, and sending it over there in the form of physical assistance and not giving them cash. And of course, some of the cash that they are getting, I guess it's in question. Either way, back to this article. On December 5th, 1994, the presidents, again, we talk about START 1, how they had to sign the non-proliferation. Excuse me there for a second. Back to the START 1, we've gone over that. The terms of the Budapest Memorandum, I think we've read that already, what they talk about. However, there's some doubling down that I think we need to do in this paragraph. The Budapest Memorandum is formally entitled Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Properly understood, the memorandum is not the source of the agreement among the signatory states. Rather, the memorandum merely, although nonetheless importantly, reflects commitments of security assurances made by the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom towards Ukraine. Additionally, the U.S., UK, and Russian security assurances include not to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon state party to the Proliferation Treaty, which again refers to one of Putin's statements. The legal status of the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum is not a treaty and did not reflect any new international legal obligations. Oh, we're going to give you feel-good words. but not obligations or guarantees. For any of the signatory states, rather, the memorandum was meticulously drafted to avoid giving any impression of legal obligation, something I referred to earlier that, again, they've meticulously drafted this to where, nobody's got any real obligation. We kind of are going to be able to do what's best for us at the time anything happens. We'll just refer to all these different treaties and pick and choose what we want, cafeteria style, and make use of what we need to make use of for our own betterment. Or in this case, if we got to print some money and help out some of our people that's helped us get elected, and we can lift some other countries up in the meantime. Oh, that's my side note, by the way. For example, both during the 3-year negotiations period and the drafting of the memorandum, U.S. State Department officials insisted on using the term assurances instead of guarantees. We've been through this. Complicating this terminological issue was the fact that the Ukrainian and Russian languages, again, more clarification here, use one word for both English words, guarantee and assurance. I repeat, complicating this terminological issue was the fact that Ukrainian and Russian languages use one word for both English words, guarantee and assurance. To address this issue during a key meeting involving delegations from all 3 states, U.S. officials read for the formal negotiating record a statement to the effect whenever a guarantee appeared in the Ukrainian Russian language text of the trilateral statement, it was to be understood in the sense of the English word assurance. As I said earlier, the word guarantee and assurance kept coming up, but Russia and Ukraine see it as guarantee, and the English word is assurance, giving the United States, well, a little wiggle room, if you might want to know. And that might be why the United States has gone back to just assurances and assistance in giving them stuff, but not sending troops over there. The Budapest Memorandum, by its terms, creates no new international law. We've gone over that. Furthermore, the memorandum does not use terms agree or agreement. That's interesting. New information for me. Furthermore, the memorandum does not use the terms agree or agreement. Rather, it refers to all commitments as reaffirmations, which suggest not new pledges, but rather reiteration of prior commitments. All of this stuff is ambiguous. All of this stuff is left up to interpretation, again, depending on what time this agreement comes up or the treaty comes up, however you want to word it, and at what time it's interpreted and at whose to benefit at that time. These features of the memorandum and the context of the negotiation or more broadly demonstrate that the signatory states, at least the United States and Russia, had no intention to be bound as a matter of international law such that non-compliance would amount to an internationally wrongdoing act under the international law of state responsibility. See, they meticulously crafted it. It was done in a way that nobody who signed the agreement would be bound. And in my interpretation, that simply means that, whoever needs to manipulate it at the time that it happens, that they don't get slapped on the hand. They kind of can do what they want to continue playing on this money laundering playground, and in this case, let the war destroy all of the evidence. I'll continue. Even the trilateral statement was the document. We did that. Yep. And rather than an agreement. Finally, the operative paragraphs of the Budapest Memorandum refer to almost exclusively to Ukraine only as an object of the commitments, but never as having obligations. The one exception is paragraph 6, which states that the signatory states, including Ukraine, will consult in the event a situation arises that raises a question concerning these commitments. This further undermines any effort to characterize the memorandum in legal terms or to refer to it as an agreement, legal or otherwise. That was the memorandum that I read. The first memorandum, first thing that I read was the memorandum, and it refers to paragraph 6, which I was, well, you got it. True. The preambular paragraphs of the memorandum note Ukraine's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state, as well as Ukraine's commitment to eliminate nuclear weapons from its territory. However, given the negotiating positions of the parties, it is clear that these references were purposely included in the preamble rather than in the operative section. Furthermore, it is telling that neither reference suggests a new legal obligation nor is characterized in terms of an agreement between the signatory states, once again using the term commitment rather than agreement, which goes back to the reason I'm bringing all this to you about the Budapest Agreement, which is there's a lot of ambiguity going on in your minds, but they're not really referencing the Budapest Memorandum, which I think is um, being done deliberately because they don't want to admit that, hey, we've got this out there, but we can interpret it ourselves. And I think that's extremely important when you look at what's what we are bound to and what we are not bound to at the time that it's happening. I know that's kind of redundant in a way. However, I think it's important to double down on. Again, concluding remarks from Robert Lawless is the Budapest Memorandum represents a significant point in post-Cold War relations and nuclear disarmament. Its importance can be understood by considering that the world would have been like had Ukraine refused to negotiate and instead decided to retain the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. Indeed, they probably still have their borders and they probably still have Crimea, that's for sure. Indeed, some in Ukraine have expressed regrets about Ukraine's decision to relinquish nuclear power states. These regrets are no doubt sharpened by Russia's aggressive war against Ukrainian territory and sovereignty, which has now been ongoing for 10 years. The memorandum is also important because it reminds us of the important distinction between political commitments and legal obligations, which I think, side note here, are important when we hear things in the news and we hear, again, when you hear Trump talk about mineral rights and now Putin's the aggressor, and you hear people who were thought of as conspiracy theorists that there were Nazis in there. But I'm telling you, to kind of dispute that Zelensky is Jewish, and then you talk about the non-proliferation treaty, you bring Iran into all this, and you begin to wonder what the real intentions are, what's really happening, and why is there so much ambiguity. And we've read in this article that is intentional. The memorandum also is important because it reminds us of the important distinction between political comments and legal obligations. When negotiations began, Ukraine sought legally binding guarantees. When negotiations began, Ukraine sought legally binding guarantees from the United States that it would intervene should Ukraine's sovereignty be breached. It goes back to some 30 years ago. Although it was forced to settle for less, Ukraine nonetheless has sought to frame the memorandum in international legal terms, including perhaps by registering it with the Secretariat of the United Nations in 2014 for inclusion within the UN treaty series. Although the treaty series series includes not only treaties but also international agreements. Notwithstanding Ukraine's claims regarding international law, the Budapest Memorandum is a non-legally binding document reflecting political commitments rather than international law. This fact should not be overstated. It seems implausible that, had the memorandum reflected legal obligations, Russia would have refrained from breaching Ukraine's sovereignty and invading its territory. I'd like to point out now, at the end of all this interpretation and articles, why didn't they do something that had a commitment within international law instead of just a memorandum and a suggestion? And how could all of these states agree to this? Of course, we can say United States and Russia doesn't want to agree to anything because it would bind them possibly into a war against each other had they both signed something with international law. Because if they sign something that binds them to international law, would they have gotten into a war with each other when all of this came up when Russia went into Ukraine? In conclusion, nonetheless, the parties of this agreement, non-legal though it may be, clearly intended that it not be devoid of meaning altogether. Regardless of the legal character of the memorandum, Ukraine acceded to nuclear disarmament as its side of the bargain. In any event, recent public discourse between Ukrainian and Russian officials regarding the legal character of the memorandum demonstrates that states care deeply about the normative status of their commitments. In this regard, international law remains relevant, including the context of today's most pressing global security challenges. Once again, give credit to Robert Lawless, who's an associate professor in the Department of Law and managing director of the Lieber Institute for Law and Land Warfare at the United States Military Academy in West Point. Credit to him for that great article. And as we wrap up today's episode of of my podcast on the Budapest Agreement, I just wanted you to, again, as you're hearing things in the news, hearing things that are going on, refer in your mind to the Budapest Agreement, because they're not referring to it, nor are they referring to the agreements. You might get a couple little news stories here and there, dribble drabs, but I kind of think that's intentional too, because once you start referring to the memorandum and the international law, I think it kind of puts pressure on the country, on these countries. Not that we shouldn't be putting pressure on them, but it could bring other things out. But I think that the fact that they've disregarded the agreement after Ukraine was vulnerable as a sign that maybe they're the bad actor, maybe they're not, who knows? We will never know, because as we've learned in these articles, that all of these agreements, all these things are going on, have been intentionally written in an ambiguous way to be able to, how shall we say, cover up possibly their money laundering schemes that are going on that we've always kind of seen signs of in the last few years, especially with Biden's comment, which I've said there's an article out there that says, hey, there was probably more that he was trying to cover up, and his son was just a small part of it, which I think is an example of what's going on internationally with a lot of things that are happening in Ukraine as to why we're not doing more and other countries aren't doing anything differently. I sincerely hope that the podcast has shed some light on some things that maybe you didn't notice before, or maybe you'll do a deep dive into. I highly recommend Roger Stone's movie, Ukraine on Fire, because I think there's a lot of different things in there that I couldn't really have the time to bring out now. And I want to thank you again for tuning in. I'll invite you to go to my website, williamwallace.net. Check out some of my other sponsors. Also, check out RNC Store at rncstore.com. Use the promo code WWFA. There's some health-related things. Again, check out Bond Arms at bondarms.com, My Pillow, Patriot Mobile, and go to those websites and use the promo code WWFA to get some discounts, and as a way to help out my store, my podcast and my show. I really appreciate your time, and I'd be honored and grateful if you give me some feedback and pass this podcast on to somebody else that you think needs the information, or would like to get enlightened on what might be going on an international level. Have a great day. Thank you so much, and God bless America.